Welcome back to chapter 11. This is video 2, and we are going to start talking about memory. So, memory is the consequence of learning and involves persistence of learning. So, memory is what happens when you actually learn something, you remember it, and it involves persistence of learning. So the more you see something, the more you go over information, the more persistent you are about gathering new information and repeating that new information, the longer it will stay in your brain, in your central nervous system as a memory. We have two types of memory. We have short-term working memory and long-term memory. Short-term working memory. The reason it's called working memory is because this is the memory that you actually use often. It is what you're using right now to take the information that I'm saying, and you are moving it around in your brain to make it make sense. You're trying to connect it to other concepts that you've learned or that you've heard of in the past. You are working to take this information and hopefully solidify it in your mind so that it becomes a long-term memory. So this is the memory that you're actively using, and that's why it's called working memory. Short-term memory is where the neurons connect in a circuit. A circuit is basically a continuation of neuron after neuron connecting with each other in a path. That would be a circuit. The circuit is stimulated over and over. So the more you hear the information, the more you hear the same information or you add to the information that you're hearing, that circuit is stimulated again and again. Um, and that is helping you to remember that information. Once that impulse flow ceases, once that circuit is no longer being stimulated, the memory itself also ceases. This is why when you try to cram information or when you're trying to remember something short term, you have to say it over and over again, or you may have to say it out loud so that you involve other senses like hearing in order to remember that information. Because again, when that information flows, when the impulse stops, then that memory also stops. Unless it enters long-term memory via memory consolidation. So the process of having information go from short-term memory, move into long-term memory is called memory consolidation. Long-term memory holds more memory than short-term, and it tends to last a lifetime. This is why when you cram information before a test or a quiz, that information is not always guaranteed to be able to be recalled during the quiz, because the more information you try to stuff into short-term memory, the less likely you are to remember it because it doesn't hold as much information as long-term. Long-term memory, you should be able to access that memory throughout your lifetime. That might mean that you have to do something special, remember something special in order to retrieve that memory, but it is there. Long-term memory changes the structure or function of your neurons. It makes new synaptic connections by increasing branching of the processes. So each of your dendrites, each of your axons, the more memories you move from short-term to long-term memory, the more branches are created by those dendrites and axons, which allows each dendrite, each axon to make new connections with other neurons. What this does is it solidifies that memory, that information in your brain, and it allows you to be able to retrieve that information from multiple different ways. For example, we're talking about memory right now, and you're trying to remember the difference between long-term and short-term memory. If you were able to remember about memory from the cerebellum, where it's located in the cerebellum. You're able to remember it because of sounds that you hear, or things that you smell, or uh, touching your forehead in a particular place. All of those are different ways to retrieve that information. And by making more and more connections, you may be able to retrieve the same information by coming from different directions. So let's say you smelled oranges, and as we were studying this information, you were eating an orange. So now the smell of an orange helps you to pull up the information about memory. So the more synaptic connections you make, the more you're able to remember the information, and the more you're able to retrieve those memories from your long-term memory. Long-term potentiation. Please look up the word potentiation so that you can understand what this phrase means. But long-term potentiation is the increase in neurotransmitter release and effectiveness of synaptic transmission upon repeated stimulation. So the more you are stimulated, the more you get this information, the more repetition you have with each piece of information you have, the more neurotransmitters are being released in those synaptic clefts, and the more effective that synaptic transmission is. So the moral of the story is, make sure that whenever you are trying to learn new information about anatomy, about pharmacology, about whatever class you're taking, you need to take time to repeat that information over and over. You need to make time to repeat that information in different ways, view it from different ways, so that you can have more neurotransmitter release, and those releases can be more effective, and you're able to pull that information up more quickly. That is memory. Remember, I mentioned previously that the diencephalon is a portion of the brain, this in the cerebrum. The diencephalon sits between the cerebral hemispheres but above the brain stem. It is surrounded by the third ventricle. So the third ventricle encases the diencephalon. Diencephalon is composed of gray matter. Remember, gray matter is unmyelinated neurons. So that will be the axons and cell bodies of neurons that are unmyelinated. Keep in mind that cell bodies are never myelinated. It's only the axons that are myelinated. So if you have a group of cell bodies in any given location, it must be gray because there's no myelination. The diencephalon is divided into different parts. You have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the optic tract, the optic chiasma, the infundibulum, posterior pituitary, the mammillary bodies, and the pineal gland. So let's talk about parts of the diencephalon. You have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the limbic system. The thalamus is the gateway for sensory impulses ascending to the cerebral cortex. Remember, information that ascends, that moves upward, is sensory information coming from the periphery, going into the brain, ascending from wherever it is into the brain to be processed. So the thalamus is the gateway, which means that it is where all that sensory information passes through as it's going to the cerebral cortex. The thalamus receives all sensory information except for the sense of smell. So taste, touch, sight, hearing, all of those are received by the thalamus. The thalamus then channels those impulses to the appropriate part of the cerebral cortex for interpretation. Previously, we looked at the brain, and there were several little oval circles that were overlaid over the brain. over the cerebrum. Remember, those were different centers of the body, so different processing centers. So the thalamus will take those sensory impulses and send them to the appropriate center in the cerebral cortex to be interpreted as whatever sense it is. The hypothalamus. The hypothalamus helps us maintain homeostasis. The way it does that is by regulating the activity of your organs, such as heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, water and electrolyte balance, etc. So what it does is anytime there is an imbalance, anytime there is a stimulus that is and anytime there's a stimulus, whether it is increase in temperature, decrease in temperature, increase in pH, decrease in pH, whatever it is, the organs, the receptors on the organs are paying attention to those changes, and it is making adjustments accordingly so that the body can maintain homeostasis. The thalamus also links the nervous system to the endocrine system. Remember that the endocrine system and nervous systems are the two systems in the body that help to regulate all aspects of functioning in your body. It helps to communicate from one body part to another. So the hypothalamus connects these two systems so that now we have two systems of communication between all of the cells in our bodies. Then you have the limbic system. The limbic system is the part of the brain and the diencephalon that controls our emotional responses, our feelings, and our behavior toward survival. So, how we respond emotionally, our emotional intelligence sits in our limbic system. Our feelings, how we feel and respond to different situations, sits in our limbic system. And how we act and react to situations where we are trying to survive, that also sits in our limbic system. Limbic system helps us react to potentially life-threatening situations, whether they are physical or psychological, whether they are real or perceived. So stress is defined as any threat that is real or perceived, meaning you actually have a bear coming to maul you, or you think about a bear mauling you. That bear might be a physical bear. That bear might be a test or final exam. That bear might be a bill that came due. It might be something happened to a favorite cousin or whatever. Anyway, those are the psychological types of upsets that your body reacts to as it tries to survive those situations. So the diencephalon made up of the thalamus, hypothalamus, limbic system. The brain stem. The brain stem is the portion that eventually continues to descend and becomes the spinal cord as it passes through the foramen magnum. The brain stem is consistent of three parts. You have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The brain stem contains nerve fiber tracts. Make sure you understand the term tract. It also contains gray matter masses, brain stem, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. And it is what becomes the spinal cord as it passes through the foramen magnum in the occiput. The midbrain. The midbrain is the most superior aspect of the brain stem. It is a short section of the brain stem that lies between the diencephalon and the pons. It contains bundles of fibers that join lower parts of the brain stem and spinal cord with those higher parts of the brain. So the midbrain connects lower portions of the brain to those upper portions of the brain. The midbrain contains the cerebral aqueduct. Remember, the cerebral aqueduct is what connects the third and fourth ventricle. It contains the cerebral peduncles. These are the main motor pathways that connect the cerebrum to the lower portions of the nervous system. It contains the corpora quadrigemina, which are the centers for the visual and auditory reflexes. So when you see something that say you see a danger, or you hear something very loud, you can respond very quickly to those things because of the corpora quadrigemina. It allows for those reflexes to things you see and hear. The red nucleus, the red nucleus is a portion of the midbrain that helps to control your posture. So let's say that you're walking from one building to another, and all of a sudden a very strong gust of wind blows, and it starts to push you sideways. Well, the reason why you're not going to fall is because of those postural reflexes. You're able to readjust and contract certain muscles, relax certain muscles so that you can maintain your upright, erect posture. That is the red nucleus. The pons is the next portion of the brain stem, inferior to the medulla oblongata, inferior to the midbrain, inferior to the midbrain. It is between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata, which is the inferior most part of the brain stem. The pons is a rounded bulge on the underside of the brainstem. So if you looked at a brain and you're looking at it, looking at the anterior aspect of the cerebrum, then you take that and you turn it. So now you're looking at the inferior portion of the brain. You'll be able to see the pons. The pons is a very unique bulge on the brainstem that is very identifiable. The pons relays nerve impulses between the medulla oblongata and the cerebrum. Remember, the medulla oblongata is the last part of the brainstem that becomes the spinal cord. It is also the first part of the brain that information from the spinal cord touches, right? Because it does become the spinal cord when information ascends, it goes through the medulla oblongata first to then be relayed to the cerebrum. It also relays impulses from the cerebrum to the cerebellum. So information that needs to go from the cerebrum to the cerebellum goes through the pons. Pons is also responsible for help to regulate your rhythm of breathing. It may not necessarily control your breathing, causing you to breathe, but it does regulate how fast you breathe. Then the medulla oblongata, the final portion of the brain stem, is the enlarged portion of the brain stem that eventually tapers off as it crosses through the foramen magnum to become the spinal cord. It conducts both ascending and descending impulses between the brain and the spinal cord. It contains cardiac, vasomotor, and respiratory control centers. It also contains non-vital reflex control centers. So the ability to be able to clear your throat by coughing, to clear your respiratory system and nasal passages by sneezing. It allows you to take the food that's in your mouth or the saliva that your body is constantly producing, allows you to swallow that information. And swallow that substance, those substances. And if something is in your stomach, in your digestive tract that your body doesn't like, it can vomit it back up. So those are non-vital reflex controls, meaning they're not vital for everyday life, but They are definitely important for your survival. If injuries occur to the medulla oblongata, that means that it's often fatal. Usually a person that has an injured medulla oblongata will not survive very long, if they survive at all. Reticular formation. The reticular formation is also called the reticular activating system. You may see it in the book or in other locations as the RAS. The RAS is a complex network of nerve fibers scattered throughout the brain stem. It extends into the diencephalon. It connects to centers in the hypothalamus, the basal nucleus, the cerebellum, and the cerebrum with both ascending and descending tracts. It filters sensory information, passing some information to the cerebral cortex and discarding unimportant information. Basically, all this information is coming through the reticular formation, but not all of it is important. So the reticular formation decides what information is important, and it'll send that to the cerebral cortex. The information that it decides is not important enough will be discarded. Just like a bouncer in a club, the bouncer only allows important people in and everybody else gets discarded because they're unimportant. The reticular formation arouses the cerebral cortex into a state of wakefulness. And when it decreases activity, that's when you're able to sleep. So the reticular formation has function in your sleep-wake cycle so that when activity of the RAS is increased, you're awake, and when activity is decreased, you're asleep. So speaking of sleep, there are two different types of sleep. Sleep is considered a normal, recurring, reversible state of unconsciousness. Unconsciousness, typically we think of unconsciousness as something that may not be reversible, but here you reverse it every time you wake up. It's characterized by limited sensory input and inhibited skeletal muscle activity. So when you're asleep, you're not able to hear, see, feel all of the sensory input that is occurring in and around your body because your body limits how much sensory information it will take in and process. So you have decreased sensory input when you are asleep, and your skeletal muscles are inhibited. This is why you don't move very much when you are asleep. There are two different types of sleep. You have non-rapid eye movement sleep or non-REM sleep. You have REM sleep or rapid eye movement sleep. Those are the two divisions of sleep. Non-REM sleep is characterized by slow wave sleep. This is when you are tired. This is when you have a decreased activity of the reticular formation. Remember, when the reticular formation activity decreases, that's when you're able to sleep. Non-REM sleep tends to be more restful and dream less. This must be why naps are so restful, because in that short period of time, you're not dreaming because you don't have enough time to go into a dream state. But you get plenty of rest in those few minutes because you're in non-REM sleep. During non-REM sleep, your blood pressure is decreased, your respiratory rate is decreased. Remember, your muscle activity, your brain activity, everything slows down. So does your blood pressure and your respiratory rate. There are three different stages to non-REM sleep that range from light sleep to heavy sleep, and we go in and out of these three stages throughout the night. We don't stay in any one particular phase. We go in and out of all three. This is why sometimes you're able to hear the things that go bump in the night, and sometimes you're not, because you are at different stages of unconsciousness from light light where you can hear and receive more information, to heavy where you can hear and receive very little information while you're asleep. Then you have your rapid eye movement sleep or REM sleep. This is called paradoxical sleep because some areas of the brain are active. So remember, we're still unconscious, we're still asleep, we're still unable to move as much or um, have as much activity as when we are awake, but there is more activity in the brain than with non-REM sleep. The heart rate and respiratory rates can then become irregular, and this is where dreaming occurs. So the paradox is you're unconscious, but your brain is more active. Even though this information is not highlighted red, I highly recommend that you look over the different types of sleep disorders just so that you can be familiar with them, because you may need this information for yourself or for your family. So different types of sleep disorders. Let's end the video here at sleep disorders. We will continue with the cerebellum in the next video.